Hi, and welcome to our conversation on John chapter 13. John chapter 13 tells a story that maybe some of you are or are not familiar with, I'm not sure. But Jesus actually takes a towel and he performs the activity of a servant. He washes the disciples' feet. Probably not an uncommon thing that people would have done as a way of welcoming their guests into a home. But it was the job of the servants to do that, not the people who were the leaders of the house. And so Jesus takes upon himself the role of a servant. He humbles himself and he washes their feet. I think this particular section of Scripture, I should say that action, is pretty consistent with what we saw all the way back in John chapter 1, where we heard John discuss the fact that Jesus, who became flesh and lived for a while among us, was actually the same God who was there at creation and created everything that you see, everything that's here. Jesus was there. And yet he condescended to become a human being. That's, if you remember, that's really what we celebrate around the time of Christmas, that God became a human being. He became flesh and lived for a while among us. Why would God condescend to come among us? Why would Jesus condescend to be a servant and wash people's feet? I think that was just the nature of his ministry. It certainly was a way of showing us how we're supposed to live toward one another. Jesus makes it very clear here that he's not saying, I'm doing this because I don't want to be Lord and your teacher anymore. In fact, he says, that's exactly what I am. I am still your teacher. This action of washing their feet actually derives out of his confidence and his connection with the Father. That's early on in the chapter. He knew who he was, and yet he still did this. He did this purposefully. Jesus will say in other places in some of the other Gospels that people who are leaders in the community, people who are leaders in governments, they don't serve. They have people who serve them. They lord it over the people who are under them. And that's a pretty classic definition of what happens with many people who get into and want to get into positions of power. They want the prestige, they want the power, they want the money, they want whatever it is that comes with being a powerful person. And maybe it just feeds their ego. Jesus humbles himself and he washes the disciples' feet. It's in this same chapter that he will tell us something that should characterize every church in every nation on the earth. And that is that people will know that people in those churches are following God and are his disciples when they love one another. Love is such a vague term sometimes. It's such a big, broad concept. We tend to think of love as some emotional, warm feeling. And not bad. That's a pretty good start. But the way love is defined in the Bible and by Jesus himself, love becomes an action. Love becomes more like something we do. Perhaps you've heard of John 3:16. We covered that, where God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. You might want to go and take a look also at 1 John 3:16 and the context around it, because John says several really interesting things in the letter that he writes, not the least of which is he makes it very clear. Love is something you do. It's not just something you feel. Love acts. Love does things for others. It isn't just a warm feeling, but in fact, it is evidence of God's presence among us. When we love one another, people will know that God is with us. Think about that as you consider Jesus humbling himself to be a servant, and the point of love being an action, that we are supposed to do things to love one another. Have a good conversation this week. Look forward to seeing you next time.